I'll be speaking to Sam Charles Hamad. He is a Scottish-Egyptian writer and leftist. He's written frequently for the Daily Beast and Al-Arabi Al-Jadid and other periodicals and websites. He is presently in Edinburgh. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stanley.
The British government is considering joining the warfare in Syria. Saturday, there was an anti-war rally in London. Thousands, organized by the Stop the War Coalition, protested with signs saying, "Don't bomb Syria," and "Not in my name." Now, you're up in Edinburgh, so I don't think you were at the London rally, but what have you heard about it?
I've heard there was around 5,000 people there, which is actually quite big for Stop the War Coalition. At the last time, after the Ghouta attacks, they held these hands-off Syria demos, and there was only around 500 people in the London demo, so it's quite big for them, but on a national level, it's quite small. So it's obvious that they're just appealing to a kind of core of the broad left, if you like. I actually thought it would be bigger given Corbyn's ascendancy to the leadership of the Labour Party, but it was quite small. But no, the speakers were dismal, and the entire operation of that organisation has been for a long time extremely conservative, and especially with regards to the Arab Spring, actively supportive of counter-revolution. So that's my summary of the demo on.
All right, let me, for our listeners who are not that familiar with Corbyn and his ties with the Stop the War Coalition, could you explain that first?
He was one of the founding signatories of the Stop the War Coalition, and he was their national chair for quite a while. In fact, he resigned as national chair when he became leader of the Labour Party, or shortly after. But he appointed, for example, Seamus Milne, who's quite a famous Guardian journalist here in the UK, who's also part of the Stop the War Coalition, and who is an unapologetic Stalinist and an unapologetic supporter, for example, of Vladimir Putin. He's met Putin. He's been to many he's been to some sort of big propaganda function about Ukraine on behalf of Vladimir Putin, which Putin attended. So he's of the Stalinist left, so to speak, and he's Corbyn's director of communications. So that's Corbyn's relationship with the Stop the War Coalition. He technically doesn't have one anymore, but he's still the kind of figurehead, so to speak, of it.
So, I mean, that's kind of impressive for a leader of an anti-war coalition. Now, as leader of the biggest party in Britain. Am I right?
It's got the largest membership in England. Yes, yep, it totally has. Did
he speak at the rally?
No, Corbyn.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I think that they have. I think that because the Labour Party is split between the kind of, you've got the centrists, who are kind of careerists, and then you've got the Blairist core, and the Blairites they're like right wing, and then you've got the kind of, in the parliamentary party, you've got like the small group of left, a really small group of left MPs who support Corbyn in the parliamentary party. In the membership, though, you've got he won it with 60% of the vote, so the membership are ultra supportive of Corbyn, but the parliamentary party kind of are basically, I mean, even though some of the centrists are obviously make up his cabinet, they're kind of opposed to him in a general sense. So I think that balance of forces has meant that he's had to stop, for example, appearing directly on platforms with people like George Galloway and who in my opinion is an open anti-Semite, and other kind of.
Okay, maybe we can get it to Galloway later, but right now, let's get back to that rally. You said the speakers were dismal. Who were some of the speakers, and what did they say?
Right, so you had, for a start, you had Owen Jones. Owen Jones is okay. I've had Owen Jones actually. You mentioned before we came on air about Mother Agnes. Sorry, I know that you might have to explain to your readers who Mother Agnes is, but anyway, Mother Agnes was basically being used by the Assad regime as a kind of propaganda to go around the world spreading lies about the Ghouta chemical weapons massacre. And the Stop the War Coalition had invited her to speak at an event. So a group of us, a group of Arabs, a group of leftists, a group of Syrians got together, and we basically stopped that happening. And one of the ways we stopped that happening was appealing to Owen Jones, who's a very famous journalist here in the United Kingdom and Labour Party supporter. And we appealed to him to say that he'd cancel his appearance as Mother Agnes. And he cooperated with us, and he was fine about it, but he is dodgy on Syria. He basically supports the kind of Patrick Cockburn line on it, that it's all about jihadists and proxies of imperialism and of Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So they had Owen Jones on, and he was the only one who very briefly mentioned, literally out of all the speakers, he was the only one who actually mentioned the Assad regime in a negative capacity. Owen Jones was the only one who did that, but mostly his talk was about how the British government should go after Saudi Arabia for funding ISIS, or Daesh, as I call them, and that kind of nonsense. But so you had Owen Jones, and he was the kind of good end of it, and that's saying something. Then you had people like Tariq Ali, who for a long time has been perpetuating the worst kind of counter-revolutionary nonsense about Syria. Genuinely dark corners of the internet type conspiracy theories and these lofty ideas about how revolutions should wait for, I don't know, until they read New Left Review or something like that. But sorry, that was a joke. But so they had Tariq Ali on, and his speech was without a doubt the worst, which is saying something considering George Galloway was on the platform. Yeah.
Did you say George Galloway was there? Did he speak?
Yeah, George Galloway was on the platform, but Tariq Ali actually outdid him from what I hear. And I've heard Tariq Ali's speech, and I've heard reports from people who heard it as well. And so, Tariq Ali basically, firstly, he made the case that he made the case that there was no revolution in Syria for a start. There was no moderates, as he calls them, and it was all jihadists who are fighting the Assad regime. And David Cameron's comments about 70,000 moderates were lies, and there's no moderates, and so on and so forth. But he also went further by effectively praising the Russian intervention, which, as we know, has not been against ISIS, but has been against the Syrian rebels, and of course has killed many civilians as well. But it's primarily been against the rebels who are fighting to overthrow Assad and the rebels who have fought ISIS in the past. And he also, and it was rhetoric, I know, but he also said that if the United Kingdom truly wants to fight ISIS, they should team up with Russia and the Assad regime.
Yeah, I heard that. That was a funny way of putting things.
Well,
let's talk about that number 70,000, because I've seen that in the British press.
Yep. And
a lot of debate about it.
Mm-hmm.
In your mind, in your view, how many are would you say are the democratic and revolutionary forces? Or whatever vocabulary you want to use.
Right. Of the revolutionary forces, 70,000 is a conservative estimate. I mean, you could literally go through the brigades. We all know about them. They're not hiding. They're there. You know what I mean? They've been fighting this war for over 4 years. So that 70,000 number is a conservative estimate that only takes into account secular nationalist forces like the Southern Front of the Free Syrian Army, which is about 25,000 people in the south of Syria, and the northern FSA brigades as well, which, they're in Aleppo, Idlib, and so on and so forth, Hama and Homs, and they're around 20,000. And then you've got honestly, you can look these forces up. They've been accounted for by so many people, and they obviously account for themselves. For example, you've got Jabhat al-Shamia in Aleppo, which has around I don't know, 2,500 to 5,000 troops. You get the point that I'm making.
Mm-hmm.
So
now, I may paraphrase you, but
yeah.
I think you said something at one point. I've been reading you on Facebook.
Yeah.
The only opposition in Syria that some on the left can appreciate are seculars like Kurds who look Western and aren't religious, and that any Syrian rebel who says a religious phrase is immediately under suspicion or hostility by the left.
Absolutely. I mean, these were arguments that were literally being made. It's unbelievable. I'll never forget at the start. I mean, I'll never forget. So you had the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, and then it kicked off in Libya, and then I'll never forget when it kicked off in Syria. I was listening, oddly enough, to George Galloway's radio show. George Galloway used to have this national radio show on Talk Sport, which gets, I don't know, millions of listeners. And anyway, I'll never forget him saying that he was disconcerted about the protests in Syria. And it wasn't even an armed revolution at this stage, because he heard the protesters shouting Allahu Akbar, which obviously means God is great, which is ridiculous. I mean, any Arabic speaker says that phrase, it's like saying, good God or whatever, or thank God is the same equivalent phrase. But it's so ridiculous to even talk about that. But that's the kind, especially from somebody who supports, like Hamas, for example, who would use similar phrase as George Galloway does. But he was using it precisely because he was supported the Assad regime. That's the only reason. He wasn't disconcerted at all. He was just planting the seeds of the idea that this was actually an Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia-sponsored Wahhabi uprising against the great secular Assad regime.
Now, talking about Saudi Arabia, and maybe here we'll disagree. Earlier you talked about people in the demonstration in London saying, the government ought to go against Saudi Arabia. Mm. I mean, a lot of us here in the U.S. Think the U.S. should break with Saudi Arabia for a lot of things, Yemen and Bahrain and the way it treats its own people.
Yep.
But what about in Syria? What do you, in your view, what is the Saudis doing in Syria?
Well, firstly, let me just say that I've been opposed to Saudi Arabia my entire life. Absolutely, it's a horrific, totalitarian, fascistic regime. But it's not that. But exactly, when it comes to Syria, Saudi Arabia, for a multitude of reasons, has not funded jihadists. It has funded mostly secular national forces that have fought against Daesh, ISIS, and it has played within the context of Syria. I must emphasize that it has played a more progressive role than people give it credit for. Now, that might be hard for a lot of people to take in, because Saudi Arabia is considered such a bastion of reaction and so on and so forth. And trust me, I agree. I would love to see a revolution against Al Saud, the theocracy in that country. Absolutely, you would no bigger supporter of it than me. I was raised by a Nazarist. I'm totally opposed to Saudi Arabia, but within the context of Syria, it hasn't funded Daesh, which is what the left always say, including Jeremy Corbyn, by the way. Basically, it really hasn't. They're completely. I've just finished a 20,000-word essay for an upcoming book that I might as well plug, called Kayana, The Unmaking of the Syrian Revolution, which is for a small publishing house called Uncant. And I've just finished a 20,000-word essay on the continuity and the irreconcilable differences between Daesh and Saudi Arabia. And these entities are completely and utterly hostile to one another. As Daesh have said on multiple times, Daesh is waging a low-level war against Saudi Arabia in Iraq from the Al-Anbar province. It's bombed Shia mosques in Saudi and so on and so forth. Read its statements about Al-Salul. Al-Salul is the word that they use for Al-Saud. It's a derogatory term. And it calls Saudi Arabia the head of the snake and the source of the disease, which, because they believe Saudi Arabia is basically the embodiment of anti-Islamic rule in the Muslim world. So, Daesh and Saudi Arabia are completely ideologically antagonistic to one another.
What about the charges? The charges that the Saudis are not supporting ISIS or Daesh, as you say, but other Islamic groups inside of Syria.
The only Islamic group that Saudi Arabia supports is Jaish al-Islam. And trust me, I am not a fan of Jaish al-Islam, but the reason that Saudi Arabia set up, it helped broker the creation of Jaish al-Islam, which was, that's the Army of Islam, by the way, just in case for your listeners. The reason that it set up Army of Islam was to take away recruits from Jabhat al-Nusra, that's Al-Qaeda in Syria, because obviously Jabhat al-Nusra was recruiting from the pre-existing Salafi population in Syria. So the Saudi Arabia wanted to divert the flow of traffic from Jabhat al-Nusra into Jaish al-Islam, who are pro-Saudi. They're a pro-Saudi Salafi force, while Jabhat al-Nusra are an anti-Saudi Salafi force, and like honestly, irreconcilably anti-Saudi Salafi force. So that's the only Islamist force that Saudi has funded. It funded the Syrian Revolutionary Front of Jamal Maruf, which was the leading force in the 2014 offensive against the Islamic State, and it's a secular nationalist force. It is the biggest funder through Jordan of the Southern Front of the Free Syrian Army. These are secular nationalist forces who are supportive of the creation of a democracy in Syria, a non-sectarian democracy in Syria. It wouldn't, because of incredibly, well, not incredibly complicated, but we don't have time to go into them today, but because of the struggle between the Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia in the region, King Abdullah wouldn't fund any brigade in Syria that had the Muslim Brotherhood in it. But when he died, King Salman took over, and he was much more pragmatic. So then you started the anti-tank weapons coming into groups like Jaish al-Fatah, which contains Failaq al-Sham, that's the Sham Legion, which is Muslim Brotherhood, which believes in Islamic democracy, I should say, like the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, or like the AKP in Turkey, or what have you. And they fought, when they liberated Idlib, they had Druze fighting with them. And you know, hardline jihadi Salafis, they obviously consider Druze to be unbelievers, and so on and so forth. So, you know, these are moderate Islamist groups that were receiving TOWs from Saudi Arabia. And if it wasn't for Saudi Arabia providing these TOWs, the rebels wouldn't have, well, it would have taken them a much longer time to liberate Idlib, and it would have, and when Russia first intervened, and the Assad regime, Iran and Hezbollah, as well as Shia militias, went on a massive offensive in Hama and Homs against Jaish al-Fatah, it was the Saudi-sourced TOWs, these anti-tank weapons, that managed the rebels to defeat the Assad regime.
Right, this is getting very detailed and practically on the street-by-street level, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But I
want
to get back to some larger questions.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'll try.
It's very interesting. You know, we think one thing about Saudi Arabia, and you know, we assume we know what it's doing in Syria, but it is what it is. You know, and we have to know what the actual facts are.
Yep.
You've written that Daesh will never be defeated as long as the Assad regime remains. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, there's two aspects. First is the material aspect, which is quite literally that if the Assad regime hadn't launched war against those who rose up against it, Daesh wouldn't exist in Syria. It would be in the Al-Anbar province in Iraq mostly. It wouldn't have a presence in Syria. That's number one. So the war on that level sustains it. Secondly, there's the ideological aspect. Now, the Assad regime, as part of its counterinsurgency, it targets civilian areas with its air force, rebel-held civilian areas, so that the revolution is basically detached from its material base, from its civilian base, civil base, if you like. And it does this by bombarding it with barrel bombs and its air force and its artillery and so on and so forth. And that's what's led to the massive civilian casualties and the refugee crisis. Now, a dynamic of this is obviously sectarian, because the Assad regime is majority Alawite, and the forces it's got fighting for it are majority Alawite and, of course, Shia in the form of Hezbollah in Iran. So, and those it targets are obviously Sunni, which is the majority population of Syria. So this itself provides a logic for Daesh to move in and cultivate this kind of this sectarianism and feed off it. I mean, the founder of Daesh, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, said way back in 2005 that his entire strategy was to get these listless Sunnis, and I'm quoting him, wake these listless Sunnis up under the annihilating death of the Shia, or he called them Sabians, which is a derogatory Islamic term for Shia. And so Daesh cultivate that and the identity politics and kind of make a fascism out of it, so to speak. And of course you've just got people who are looking for normality, and Daesh move in with their state building enterprise, and they provide Sunnis with a modicum of normality, with a modicum of they take over the state apparatuses, they continue running them, and so on and so forth. They set up their own state apparatuses, so they provide that kind of normalcy. And of course, you have the phenomenon of the Assad regime ignoring ISIS. This is, a lot of people don't know that the Assad regime actually cultivated ISIS. ISIS would never have been able to create a khilafah without the Assad regime ignoring it. So, for example, when the rebels, and say the rebels hold one part of Syria over there, let's have an actual example. In Raqqa, the rebels held part of it, and Daesh held another part of it, to put it in really simple terms. And the Assad regime would quite literally bombard the rebel-held area and leave ISIS alone. And then when ISIS started attacking, it would, not in any direct sense, but it would literally start attacking the rebels, to weaken the rebels, to allow ISIS to take over. And the reason that the Assad regime does this is because, A, it provides its base, which is mainly Alawite, with the idea that the main opposition is ISIS, who are this fascistic, genocidal entity, and there's no doubt about that, who want to murder Alawites and cleanse them from the Islamic lands and so on and so forth. So that keeps the Assad regime's base unified, and also it appeals to the international community, because obviously ISIS are an expansive and jihadi entity, so they commit terrorist attacks abroad and so on and so forth. So Assad can then pose as the person who's on the front lines against ISIS. But of course, he's actually doing this at the expense of the rebels who are fighting him. And of course, and on many occasions, the international community have taken his side and have said that, I think we might have to, at least start coming to terms with Assad regime as the main force in Syria against ISIS and so on and so forth.
One thing we haven't got into was the whole question of Iran. Some say that Iran is acting as an imperialist in Syria, and I read one piece that said that the Syrian army and many of the units are actually led by Iranian officers.
Yeah, so take that point on the Syrian army. 2/3 of the Syrian army was demobilized by the Assad regime, because the Syrian army is a majority Sunni force, but it's led entirely by Alawites. So in order to stop, to limit defections, the Assad regime demobilized 2/3 of it, and basically allowed ultra-loyal, often led by members of his own family units, to be the core of his forces. But the actual forces leading the fight on the ground are a group called the National Defence Forces, and these are basically a kind of super militia. At the start of the conflict, these Shabiha forces, that means like basically henchmen of the regime. They were doing like a lot of the fighting and a lot of the dirty work of the regime and so on and so forth. But Iran came in and kind of amalgamated them into the National Defence Forces on the same model as their Basij militia, the Iranian Basij militia that it has at home. So, I mean, that's one sense in which Iran is acting in an imperialistic manner. You get into a technical argument about imperialism here and so on and so forth and what that means. But I like to put it that Iran is behaving in an imperialistic manner. For a start, as it has boasted, the members of the regime, the Assad regime would have fallen years ago if it wasn't for Iranian intervention. Iranian intervention has been massive. It's in 1 year alone they spent $15 billion on the Assad regime. They've maintained it in every way. They are acting in a imperialist manner. I'll give you one brief example. Zabadani, that was a site of a massive battle between the Syrian rebels led by Arar al-Sham and Hezbollah and some regime forces. And basically, at the end of the battle, when it was a complete stalemate, Iran and Arar al-Sham got together, and Iran basically wanted to ethnically cleanse Zabadani and move Shia populations from another part of Syria into Zabadani with a kind of purpose of a kind of de facto partition of the country along sectarian lines. So on that level, Iran is certainly acting as a kind of imperialist power. Some people call it sub-imperialism and so on and so forth. There are all these technical debates, but it certainly acts as a kind of imperialist and in some senses, like in Zabadani, colonialist kind of force. It wants to, I think Iran's solution to the crisis would be a partition of Syria along sectarian lines with an Alawite state. Of course, the Alawites wouldn't like that very much because they don't have anything culturally in common with Iran. The Alawism isn't even considered a form of Shiism by some Shia, and it certainly is quite a lot different than 12er Shiism, which is what the Iranians practice. So the Alawites, who are secular and so on and so forth, probably wouldn't want to live in a state completely dominated by Iran. But the Assad regime, to ensure its survival, has had to rely on Iran, and even some within the regime are incredibly worried about what that'll lead to, because the Ba'ath Party is obviously secular pan-Arabist, so to speak. That's at least its roots. So it's always been in favour of an alliance with Iran, but not Iranian hegemony over Syria, which is what we're seeing happening.
Okay, let's this is great, and I want to get to one last huge thing.
Okay.
Though you were unhappy with the speakers at that London rally, I understand that you also oppose British bombing of Syria.
Yeah.
And what should the left be saying about Syria?
Well, for a start, it should recognise that there is a revolutionary war happening in Syria. Now, I've been castigated many times by leftists, even leftists who support the Syrian revolution, for using the term revolutionary war. But call it whatever you like, but there is a living revolution in Syria. There are forces fighting to overthrow a dynastic tyranny, and any leftist, any progressive should be making the point that these forces are the forces that should be supported, because trust me, whether it's a year or 10 years from now, it is these forces that will form the basis, not just of a new Syrian state, but of the main military opposition to ISIS. And ISIS can't be bombed away, and it can't be wished away with these magical conspiracy theories that Saudi Arabia is funding it, and therefore if we sanction Saudi Arabia, Daesh will wither and die. No, it can only be defeated from within, and from within means the Syrians who are fighting against Assad and who have fought against ISIS. 64% of ISIS's attacks have been against Syrian rebels, while 6% of Assad regime attacks have been against ISIS. That tells you everything you need to know. The Assad regime is not a plausible opposition to ISIS, because many Sunnis, many people in Syria know that the Assad regime would be worse for them than ISIS in essence. And of course, the Syrian rebels, who are local Syrians, fighting to defend their communities, fighting to defend their country, are the only people who can defeat the Assad regime and its imperialist backers and the colonialist forces that comprise ISIS.
What about a demand that all foreign forces get out of Syria, including Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah?
Absolutely. I mean, well, it depends what you mean out. They're the only forces that are in, except for the international coalition that are bombing Daesh. I mean, and I would have just a completely different approach from then, and I've opposed them since they began their bombing campaign in 2014. But if by people mean, and here's possibly where I disagree with a few people, if by people mean by that a kind of utopian call for all external forces to leave Syria in terms of Saudi Arabia funding rebel brigades, then I completely disagree, because both sides aren't equal. One force is a force fighting against a dynastic tyranny that wants to keep everything the same, the brutality of the status quo, and the other force is fighting to overthrow that, to at least elevate struggle above, the very antithesis of struggle, which is what the Assad regime is. So that's what I'd say. I'd say to people, I'd say to any leftist that they should have one simple demand, and if I was Jeremy Corbyn, I would have stood in front of David Cameron and say, Mr. Cameron, if you truly believe in these 70,000 anti-ISIS fighters, why have you done nothing to support them? Why have you done nothing to empower these forces? And that's, of course, what Jeremy Corbyn will never do, because he's way off in a completely other direction, and another direction that converges perfectly with the Assad regime's propaganda.
Wow, there's a lot here to digest, and I hope we can talk again.
Yep.
I want to thank you for this discussion.